Hello, everyone, and welcome back aboard. Caleb and I are so excited to share with you today a little bit more about the back nine at Augusta National, or as the Augusta National Golf Club refers to it, the second nine. So you often hear the expression, the Masters doesn't start until the back nine on Sunday. And you could say the same about our podcast, except for the fact that our first nine video is also amazing. So be sure to check that out as well as this second nine one. Caleb, really excited to get going, and thanks for hopping on board.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
If I were you, I would think about climbing on board.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Caleb. Any initial thoughts, kind of after reviewing the first nine as we move over here to the back nine? Just what are your thoughts on Augusta National? What are you hoping to see more of in the back nine? Obviously, you know a bit about it, but just curious to see what you're kind of on the lookout for based on what we saw on the first nine holes.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it already. The tournament doesn't start until the second nine on Sunday. I think I can picture every hole on the second nine pretty clearly. The exception of maybe 14 and 17 are probably the least memorable in my mind. But every other hole I can picture at least a few shots from tournaments over the years. So this is a very, very well designed 9 holes, and we'll get into that. But it's also a great viewing experience and produces a ton of drama for a great tournament.
Caleb, you mentioned numbers 14 and 17. I'm not convinced they're not the same exact hole. I'm just saying I've never seen them in the same place at the same time. And those holes look really similar to me, and they play similar. And those are probably the least distinct ones, but pretty much everything else is insanely awesome on the second nine. So I'm looking forward to jumping right in.
That's a take, Drew, that I will completely agree with. Visually very similar.
Yeah. Basically the same tee shot, I think, is what it boils down to. But we will get to that very shortly. But we will start off first with number 10. And so you can see right here, you can see the approach shot on our visual part here into number 10, known as Camellia. That's the flower it's named after. If you guys didn't watch our first nine video, every single hole at Augusta National is named for a plant on the property, a flowering plant on the property. And Camellia was lucky enough to be the flower for number 10. So number 10, one of the more unique holes at Augusta National. Obviously, you're seeing the approach shot here, and that's pretty unique with such a large bunker in the middle of the fairway. But I think the tee shot is kind of the most important shot on number 10. And that's because, like number 2, it's a really, really hard dog leg to the left. And it's definitely an even harder dog leg than number 2. So you'll very rarely see players hit driver off this tee box because you just run out of room across the fairway on that right side very quickly. So the goal, you'll see a lot of players hitting 3-woods, which is a club generally players feel more comfortable they can hit a draw with, or in this case, hit a big hook with. So a lot of times you'll see players start it, and they're trying to really hook this ball 30 to 40 yards in some situations to land it on the downslope and get it as close to the bottom of the hill as they can to have a shorter approach shot into the green, because you do run out of space, again, very quickly on that right side of the hole if you hit your tee ball too straight. So trying to hug that left side as much as possible. Caleb, you mentioned it a bit at the end of our previous video for the front nine. It's so important at Augusta National to try and get the flattest lie in the fairway you possibly can, because there's so many slopes out here. It's hard to get a flat lie. Really, players will try and get down the left half of this hole as much as possible, because that is much flatter than the right side. So even if you're in the fairway, there's definitely a preferred side, and that is the left side. And it opens up, as you can see, looking at this approach shot here, a bit of an angle into the screen. Just for players to have opportunities there. One other thing I'll mention about this hole is this big bunker you see in the middle of the fairway. It's kind of an iconic bunker. You oftentimes see players hitting their second shots over it onto the green. That bunker used to be where the green was. So when Augusta National was first built and designed, the green was where that bunker is. And now the green's a good 60 to 70 yards beyond that as the course has lengthened and changed over time. But it's interesting. Sometimes you see players. I know a few years ago, Rory got a drive all the way down the hill, sort of near this bunker. And one of the commentators made the point that, if this was 1934, Rory would have just driven the green. And obviously, won't see players driving the green on a 500-yard par 4, but it does play downhill, and you can take off a lot of that yardage if you hit a good tee shot. But if your tee shot does not catch the slope and get all the way down the hill, I've seen players hit as much as 5-iron, 4-iron, 3-iron into this green if they're not able to get down the hill. But if you get down the hill, you're giving yourself a much more reasonable chance at birdie. But definitely not a birdieable hole. Again, Caleb, I'll bring it up of players with at least 5 Masters appearances in their career. Only one player has played this hole under par for his career. Caleb, can you guess who that is?
Is it Phil Mickelson?
It's not Phil Mickelson, but it's another Masters champion, someone who tends to play well at Augusta year over year.
I don't know.
Jordan Spieth has a career scoring average of 3.88 on this hole. So he's the only one under par. So Caleb, and any additional thoughts or color to add here on number 10? I know there's some great Masters memories in this hole. I think of Bubba Watson.
I was just about to tell the Bubba Watson story.
Yeah, I would love if you shared a bit more about that, because that was incredible.
Yeah, so Bubba Watson on the second playoff hole, I believe it was 2012, hit his tee shot way right, to the point where he did not have a shot at the green. He was pretty far down the fairway, way left in the woods, pine straw lie, and he hits this amazing, it had to be a complete snap hook. The shot must have taken a complete 90-degree turn out of that lie and hit the green, and he was on the green in 2. It might be one of the best shots that we've ever seen at Augusta National, especially considering the circumstances. A playoff hole. It was a year that he won the Masters. So that's probably my favorite memory from this hole.
Yeah, Caleb, when I went to the Masters with my dad the following year, when we got to number 10, we made a beeline to the spot where Bubba hit the shot from. And actually standing there, I can't even express how insane of a shot that was, because the amount he had to hook it would have been so hard with any club, let alone a sand wedge, which is what he hit. And, wedges are the hardest clubs to hook in the bag, just because there's so much loft on them. So that was an unbelievable shot, and one that I can replay in my mind, 11 years later, and remember it very clearly. So one of the best Masters moments of all time, without a doubt. All right, we will move on then from number 10 to number 11, and holes 11, 12, and 13 at Augusta National are known as Amen Corner. They are known as Amen Corner, not because there's anything spiritual about them, but rather because I forget who it was. A former player, made a comment in the early years of the Masters, like, man, you get through 11, 12, and 13 and with a decent score, and you're kind of just saying amen once you're done with those holes. You don't need to play them anymore. And you can definitely see it, I think, especially with holes 11 and 12, you'll see are pretty difficult. So I'll start off with number 11. Number 11 is a 505-yard par 4 and is known as White Dogwood. Number 11 is the longest par 4 on the course. And it's a hole that's changed a lot in recent years. Number 10 historically has been the most difficult hole at Augusta National year over year. But number 11 in recent years, I know for sure in 2018, and I think maybe in 2021, I have to check the number on 21, but it's played as the hardest hole in the course, and consistently is, among the top 5 hardest holes of the course. And part of that's just due to the length. Players can hit a drive, down there. The second shot does play a little bit downhill, but, the hole's over 500 yards. So you're oftentimes seeing players still hit, 4-iron, 5-iron, 6-iron into this green. And when you're hitting into the green, there's not really a lot of great places to miss, because as you can see, looking at the approach shot here on the visual we have on Spotify and YouTube, there's a big pond to the left of the green, which obviously you don't want to go in. And there are sort of mounds and a lot of open space off to the right. But the green is a little bit elevated, and there's some mounding on the right side of the green, to the point where if you hit your shot way right of the green, you kind of have to hit a delicate pitch shot sort of through or over or around the mounds. And that can get dicey pretty quick, because if you have a little too much speed coming off that mound, we've seen balls roll across the green back into the water on the left side. So it's a relatively generous tee shot. You got, again, like a lot of tee shots at Augusta National, there's space to hit it. There's areas to bail out. On the approach shot, you can also bail out to the right, but it's not really an easy pitch if you bail out to the right side. So there's just not really a lot of places for players to hit the ball here. Caleb, I don't know what your thoughts are. I honestly was not really a fan when they lengthened this hole. I know watching the Masters when I was younger, I think this hole provided a bit more of that balance of risk reward, a chance to make birdie in a more meaningful way than we see the current iteration of the hole actually doing. And I know we talked a lot about how Augusta National is so great, partly because you can make, eagle or double on every hole. And this is another hole where I just think the birdie opportunities are so limited and the downside risk is very high. So I like this hole, but I'm disappointed with some of the more recent changes as far as adding length. But I do like the decision. They took out some trees last year on the right side of this hole, which I think clears up some more angles for the approach shot, which might make it a bit more birdieable than we've seen kind of in, the past 10 years. But I don't know. I think I still have complicated feelings about number 11. What are your thoughts, Galen?
Yeah, I would say two things. I agree that I like the changes that they made last year, taking out those trees. I think that we were seeing a lot of players hit really, really bad tee shots and get rewarded with a clear line to the green. And so those changes, taking out those trees, eliminates that issue by making the fairway a little bit wider, a little bit of a better target to hit. But if you do miss the fairway, if you end up in trouble, you're not going to miss it so bad that you end up having a really good angle into the green. Almost to the extent that some players were probably aiming for that little alleyway for that angle. And the other thing is, you mentioned the mounds on the right side of the green. The slope of the fairway as you get down towards the green is pretty severe as well, and it goes right into that pond. So it's not something it's not a shot where you can run something low up and roll it onto the green, like you could maybe on other holes. As that those mounds that are a little further up in the fairway, especially if you get the wrong bounce off of those, roll straight into the pond that you mentioned, short of the green. So those are two features of the hole that kind of dictate the strategy. As we're kind of thinking about how the players are going to approach this hole. I would say that the one place that the players will miss is short right of the green. They'll have relatively straightforward pitch shots or chip shots. But it's much harder when you have the pin location in the back left.
Yeah, I think if the pin's back left, players are really hoping to hit a ball to 30, 40, 50 feet and just get out of there with par. Whereas, there's some more potential for a shot to end up close, even if it's on the fringe, if that pin's front right. One final note on number 11. In 1987, Larry Mize won the Masters, and one of the most famous moments in the history of the tournament is he chipped in for birdie from off the right side of the green. It was like an impossible chip, and he holed it and ended up going on to win. And so I would fully recommend anyone who has not seen the clip of Larry Mize chipping in, Google it, check it out on YouTube. It is such a fun. His reaction is amazing. The chip was amazing, and I think that's one of the Masters memories that stands out most to me on this hole. So, all right, we'll move on to number 12, Golden Bell, and Golden Bell is probably the most famous par 3 in the world, or one of the most famous par 3s in the world. I think 17 at Sawgrass might have something to say about being the most famous in the world, but this is an iconic hole. You've got Rays Creek, which is the tributary that kind of runs right in front of this green here. And then you got the bridge closest to us in this image that we have on screen on the left side of the green is the Hogan Bridge. And there's, the famous azaleas behind the green and the bunkers long. And this hole really is, I think, at the center of a lot of the drama at Amen Corner on the back nine of the Masters on a Sunday, because players can hit some great shots and make birdie. And we've seen a lot of large numbers and frankly complete disasters in this hole over the years. And I think this hole's only 155 yards. The green is very skinny, so players really are trying to land it sort of between the front bunker and those back bunkers and just land on the strip and leave themselves a birdie putt. So there's not a lot of place short and long to miss, but there is a lot of place left, a lot of space left and right for players to miss. So it's not like, overtly speaking, if it's not the Masters, if it's not Augusta National, if you took the hole exactly as it looks, it doesn't seem that bad for the best players in the world. But it's one of the most devious and kind of understated par 3s in the world, in the sense that the wind is always circulating all over the place in this hole. So we mentioned on the first 9 episode that the wind at Augusta National, especially in the par 3s, tends to swirl quite a bit. And where this tee box is situated is very much an open air area, but then there's trees behind you and these trees behind the green that sort of block you from completely feeling the wind. So I think a lot of players talk about how tricky it is to judge the wind there. So you see some players hit pitching wedge, you see some players hit 8 irons or 7 irons, and they're trying to knock lower shots into the green and control the spin a little bit more. And to me, it's one of the most fun holes to watch because, again, players are consistently fooled by the wind here. And I think back to the 2019 Masters when Tiger Woods won. He was one of the few people that took his medicine, hit his shot between the bunkers to 35 feet on this hole on the final round. And Francesco Molinari and Tony Finau, his 2 playing partners, both hit it in the water. Brooks Koepka, who ended up tying for second, and the group in front of him also hit it in the water. And it just shows that this is kind of the point where pressure is ratcheting up in the course. Pressure is ratcheting up in the tournament, especially in the final round. As much as I hate to reminisce back on it, I think this hole I will always associate with Jordan Spieth, my favorite player, who had a 5-shot lead at the Masters coming into this hole in 2016 and hit 2 balls in the water and made a quadruple bogey and ended up losing the Masters by a few shots to Danny Willett. One of the more painful memories, but one that I will associate with this hole, I think, for the rest of the time I watch the Masters. So Caleb, I don't know if you have anything else to add here. I think this just is a really tricky hole, and I did hear actually one more thing I'll say, Caleb, before I turn it over to you. A lot of players, because the wind feels like it's always swirling on this hole, they've realized that the wind moves the same direction on holes 10, 11, and 12. And if they can feel the wind up on the tee box at 10, where it's a higher elevation, they can kind of use that as a gauge for number 11 and number 12 as well. And so a lot of times, like players say, you can't even trust what the gust that will make you second guess your number or your club on number 12. You got to just trust the wind direction you kind of measured up on 10T, which is an interesting piece of course strategy there. So something to think about. But Caleb, I know that this is an awesome hole. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, this is geographically speaking, the lowest point on the golf course, which is another reason probably why the wind is so difficult to judge. In terms of hole strategy wise, that front middle bunker is not a bad place to be at all. Anything that's not in the water is a good place to be, but I would say you'd much rather want to be in that front bunker than in either of the back bunkers or in that back pine straw, which again, both of those places are better places to be than in the water. But especially depending on the pin location, when you have that, especially the right side pin location, you hit it in the back bunkers, you're going to have a really, really testy chip that you're really going to have to control the distance on so that you don't end up hitting it past the hole and down the hill and into the water on your second shot. So, those are things to keep in mind as you're watching players go through this hole. If they hit it long, that second shot is going to be a real tester, and it's going to be this hole is a place where you're probably not going to win the Masters on this hole, but you can definitely lose the Masters on this hole. That's pretty much how I would characterize it. I think that's one of the reasons that it's so interesting.
Yeah, one final note here too. Like you mentioned how much more accessible that left-hand hole location is than the right-hand hole location. On Sunday, they put that pin in kind of the middle front right of the green, and that just begs players to go at the pin. And as you can see on the right side of the green, there's no bunker protecting if you come up a little bit short, and that ball is rolling straight back into the water. So it's definitely a pin that makes players look like a little bit of suckers sometimes on Sunday. So that will be something to watch out, in particular on Sunday versus the other days. And you'll see the scoring probably get a good bit higher on Sunday on this hole than it does the rest of the week.
Definitely.
All right, moving on next to number 13, Azalea. Famously, Sergio Garcia won the Masters in 2017, had a daughter right after the Masters, and named her Azalea in honor of this hole and his recent triumph at the Masters that year. This hole is newly lengthened, so there's a big change to this hole, which we're going to get to in a moment. This is a really, really unique risk-reward par 5. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of ways, it's been diluted by the distance players are hitting the ball in recent years. And Augusta National has made some changes this year to ensure the hole is sort of played the way it was originally meant to be played. So you're going to, you're hitting a downhill tee shot kind of off a tee box that's behind the 12th green. And you're going to be hitting it downhill. And there's a creek, a tributary from Rays Creek that runs all the way up the left side of the hole. So you can't go left because you're in the woods in the creek. There's a little bit of space right, and the fairway all goes from right to left. So you hit your ball up on the right side of the fairway, it will tend to roll down a little bit. But the only hard part about that is your second shot into this par 5, which is reachable in 2, will often happen with the ball way above your feet. So if you're in the right side of the fairway, all of a sudden you're going to have to hit, a mid to long iron, ideally with the ball way above your feet, over water again, which circles around like up the left side of the hole and then just in front of the green. So you have to carry your ball all the way up onto the green with the ball way above your feet. So a very nerve-wracking shot for players, especially with a longer club in your hands. Like I mentioned on number 10, if you can go as far left as possible on this hole without going into the water, you will get yourself the flattest lie possible. So there's definitely an advantage trying to play this hole down the left side as much as possible and sort of hug that tributary of Rays Creek without actually going in it to leave yourself the easiest approach shot. This is a hole, unfortunately, that now players can sort of hit drivers up over the trees on the corner and sort of land their ball further down to the fairway. So in 2012, for example, Bubba Watson hit a sand wedge for a second shot into this green. And that's an extreme example because obviously he hits the ball really far compared to most players, or did back then at least. But I think, we're still seeing a trend where players are hitting 8 iron, 7 iron, 6 iron into this green instead of hitting 6 iron, 5 iron, 4 iron, 3 iron into this green. So Augusta National basically bought some land from the adjacent Augusta Country Club over this past year, and they basically moved the tee box back another 30 yards. They built a new tee box. And so the hope is that, where players were hitting 3 woods before off the tee, now their drivers will go there. So it adds a little bit more risk into the hole for players. They can still lay back with 3 wood and have a longer shot into the green, or they can hit drivers and sort of have the same shot they would have had with 3 wood in years past. So I, for one, am super excited to see how this hole is changed, because right now, as it stands, if you hit like a half decent tee shot, this hole's like an automatic birdie. And again, Caleb, we talked about it. Like, I complained about it when holes were too hard. I'm going to complain about it when the holes are too easy. This hole has not in recent years balanced the risk reward of making bogey versus making birdie, and it can happen at any time to any player. It's been much more heavily weighted to making birdies. And again, it's a par 5. It will still be one of the easiest holes on the course, but I am personally very excited to see how well this plays this year with the longer tee box. The green still kind of remains the same. Obviously, you look at the visual here, you really can't go long. Being any of those bunkers beyond the green is not a good spot to be. It's a downhill chip that runs directly towards the water, and players will often hit it from the bunker into the water. So that is definitely something to avoid. There's kind of a shelf in the back right-hand portion of this green as well, where they can put a pin. And that's maybe a pin where you'll see some players be okay with laying up, because it's a less delicate wedge shot because they have some space to work with, and they can get a wedge back on the proper ridge there in a way that they can if they're hitting like a little flip wedge, from 20 to 50 yards. So that could be a potential rationale for players laying up. But again, for the most part, I think you'll see players still go for the green and 2 here, or just they'll have slightly longer clubs in and have to contend with the slopes as the hole is designed a bit more. Caleb, anything to add here on 13?
Yeah, I've got a couple things. First, I just wanted to highlight how much different this is going to play. You mentioned, Drew, that it's 35 yards back, the tee box is. They're going to be hitting their tee shots from what used to be the 9th fairway at Augusta Country Club. We're going to little sneak preview. We're going to have a episode coming out in the relatively near future talking about the distance debate in golf, and this is one of the consequences of that. We'll address that in our future podcast. But one of my favorite shots from this hole is Phil Mickelson in 2010, the year he won. He hit his tee shot into the woods. He was in the pine straw, looked completely screwed, and he had a gap of about 5 feet between 2 trees. And I don't remember what club he had. I don't remember the yardage, but it was a pretty long ways away, out of the pine straw, and he just absolutely smashed it to about 5 feet, and it was one of the most epic shots that I've seen in a Masters tournament. Goes honestly right up there with that Bubba Watson shot that we talked about earlier in my book, both from lefties, ironically, and both from now live guys, also ironically. And to add even more irony to this conversation, Phil missed the eagle putt. So that was a tragic sequence of events, and that's probably why the shot isn't as remembered as it is, because he missed that putt. But I totally agree with you, Drew, on holes being too easy or too hard. And I think my biggest complaint with that is not necessarily like what it plays in relation to par. Is it too far, or too high, or too low compared to par? It's, is there a difference in how well players play the hole? Do players who hit good shots score better than the players who hit bad shots? And like you said, Drew, it's starting to become an automatic birdie if you just get your ball in the right place off the tee. And I'm on record, at least in our conversations, as being very much against that. At the first hole at Riviera, not being a super big fan of just automatic birdies if you are just in the fairway. I think that's a little bit too low of a bar to hop over. So hopefully that this lengthening of the tee, even as unfortunate as that is that they had to do that, hopefully that will add a little bit more drama back to this hole. Elevate it back to one of the best par fives in golf that it was, and that it will be, and a great finish to Amen Corner. Drew, I'm not really sure where you're getting Amen from. You're the only person I've ever heard call it Amen Corner, but a great finish to Amen Corner.
I'm shocked that I'm the only person you've ever heard pronounce it that way. Clearly, you haven't spent much time in Pennsylvania, Caleb. We'll put it that way.
This is true. I am a Southern boy.
Exactly, and I can't claim to be one, so I got Northeastern blood here, Caleb. So I'll stick to my Amen Corner. Thanks.
That's fair enough. The only thing I'll add to this point in the conversation is that we are playing this tournament in Augusta, Georgia. So
duly noted, for sure. Very fair. But yeah, I mean, I think the purpose of the changes, like you mentioned, Caleb, is for players to actually have to think about the second shot. And I think even like you mentioned, the primary consideration of is this hole going to make players who hit good shots and well-executed shots perform, noticeably better than those who don't? This hole doesn't separate those out. I'm hoping that the extra distance will make it so, because players who think too much about a shot and don't execute, or players who think through a shot very smartly and then execute it, the result is just going to be different there in a way that we haven't seen in the last 10 years. So I for one, again, not happy they had to add the extra tee, but that's a conversation for another time, but very happy and excited about the prospect of this hole taking on a new level of significance in the way that we see with number 15, which I think we'll get to in a few minutes here. But moving on to number 14, Caleb, you and I both mentioned this is one of those holes that I think gets a little bit forgotten amongst all the other iconic holes in the back nine. And I think it's because there's no bunkers in this hole at all. There's no water in this hole. It is just grass in front of you. And it's a relatively straight hole. The fairway does move a little bit off to the left and the green's off to the left, but the fairway basically all pitches from left to right. So the fairway is all sloped down toward the trees on the right side. This is one of those holes where going left really doesn't work for players. The trees are a little bit more dense over there. The only person I can think of successfully navigating those left trees was Tiger Woods in 2019 when he won and hit his tee shot left there on the second day. But that's not really the spot you want to miss this hole. I know I listened to a great interview with Mark Leishman's caddy, and basically his big note every single year in the yardage book on this hole is do not hit it left under any circumstance. And I think that probably can be more broadly extrapolated into this green is really the defense of this hole. This green is super severe. As you can see in the visual we have on screen, that giant ridge that flag's on top of is a huge false front. And so anything short of that will be repelled all the way back down to the front of green and even roll potentially off the front of the green, leaving you with a really hard chip or putt back up that ridge. So players want to avoid that as much as possible. And the reality is the only way to avoid that and to stay on top of that ridge without going over the green or being short of it is by being able to control the spin. So I know Patrick Reed, who won the Masters in 2018. I remember listening to an interview with him once, and he talked all about, he's like, 14 is a hole that's not talked about enough. You know, you have to hit the fairway there. You have to be playing from the fairway to control the spin enough to get a shot that even stays on the green, let alone gets close to the hole at all. So as much as I dislike Patrick Reed, that's really good advice, I think, on this hole. And he is a Masters champion and has a green jacket to show for it. So who am I to argue with that? But again, I don't think there's a lot to say here. It's not a super exciting hole, but it is a hole. Again, Caleb, it's not a hole where you win the Masters. You know, people aren't making birdies here to clinch the green jacket for the most part. But I think it is a hole where you can lose the Masters because, you know, critical bogeys in this hole at the middle of the back nine, not really what you want to see as you're kind of trying to hunt down the leaders or maintain a lead. And this is a hole that I think players probably forget about. I think fans forget about it. But I think if you don't hit the fairway, it can sneak up on you.
Yeah, not much to add, Drew. Did we mention that it was Chinese fir?
I don't think I mentioned that. Yeah, the flower here is Chinese fir. So you're good, Caleb. Nothing additional to add there on 14.
Yeah, nothing else, Drew.
Yeah,
you covered it.
Sounds good. All right, we will move on now to number 15, Firethorn. And 15 is one of the most iconic holes in the course. I'm sure those of you that are watching on YouTube or looking at the video feed on Spotify see this hole and recognize it almost immediately. There's a ton that can happen here. I think this hole, probably better than almost any other hole on the course, again, balances that risk reward of like, if you execute a really, really good shot, you have a shot at eagle. You know, there have been albatrosses made on this hole as well. Gene Sarazen, one of the most famous golfers of all time, made an albatross in the second ever Masters in 1935 on this hole, and they called it the shot heard around the world, golf's version of the shot heard around the world. And Gene Sarazen actually holed out from the fairway for an albatross. But on the other end of the spectrum, in 2018, Sergio Garcia, the defending champion, made a 13 on this hole, which is the highest score ever recorded on this hole. But there have also been 3 11s throughout the course of the Masters recorded on this hole. And that's because they're, you know, the fairway is out in front of you. So you're teeing off, the whole hole is slightly downhill. So you're teeing off, and if you really hit anything on the right half of the fairway, you're going to have a clear shot to the green. You'll have a chance to hit the green in 2 with a long iron, normally, potentially a hybrid or a wood, depending on how far back you are and how soft or firm the course is. But the green is very reachable for the far majority of players in the field. Not really a problem if you're in the right side of the fairway. If you are on the left side of the fairway, there are some dips over there, and there are some trees that kind of grow out into the side of the fairway that can block you out. So there are some great videos of players hitting huge hooks around those trees up onto the green. It's not a shot most players want to hit, though, if they can avoid it. So going left off the tee here is not ideal. Again, you're not going to be in trouble necessarily. You can still hit a clean layup most of the time from over there if you're not going to go for the green in 2. But again, anything down that right side is an absolute go zone, and there's not too much trouble on the right side of this hole. And again, even on the left side, it's you know, you can still have a safe layup and not be too concerned about that. Where this hole really gets tricky, I think, is the third shot. Second shot if you're going for the green, third shot if you've laid up, and then kind of putting. So there is a pond short of this green. Then there's basically a fairway that runs off the green straight into the pond. So if you come up short, you're going to hit the hill, roll back into the water. If you go beyond the green, there is a big, closely mown fairway area behind the green that the ball will roll down. And behind that, there is another pond. So if a ball is coming in with too much speed, it will bounce off the back of the green, roll down the slope into the water on the far side. If your ball is a little bit short, catches the front of the green, sort of doesn't quite get up there and rolls all the way back down, you're going to be in the water short of the green. So it's an approach shot where your distance has to be very precise as far as how far you're actually carrying the ball. And it can be pretty firm sometimes too when you're coming in with a longer club, which we mentioned on number 4 when we talked about the first 9. So that is another thing just to consider with the approach shot here. Is sometimes it can be hard to hold that green all the way. One thing I'll mention too, if you do decide to lay up, it's a really hard layup because the hill goes all the way downhill, right where in the good layup area. The hill goes all the way down straight into that water in that pond short of the green. So even if you are successful in your layup, you're going to have like a 50 to 100-yard wedge shot off a severe downslope over water with more water behind the green. And the green's also pretty severely sloped from back to front. So it's not really a wedge shot that I'm licking my chops to hit anytime soon. So I think if I ever played Augusta National, regardless of where I hit my tee shot, I'm going for the green in 2 because I don't want to hit that wedge shot from the downslope just short of the green. But this is one of those holes where, again, like there are birdies out here. As a player stepping up to the tee, you expect to birdie this hole. But you can ask Sergio Garcia's 5 balls in the water in the first round in 2018 how much easier that is said than done. So Caleb, I love this hole. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the start of that finishing stretch. First, 3 holes to go after this one. It's the last. I mean, you can score on 16, but 15 is your big chance to make eagle if you have a few shots to make up coming down the stretch. There's no real guarantee to score the rest of the way. So it's a pressure packed hole, even though it is a reachable par 5, one that you can eagle and birdie. Some things to note. You mentioned the water long. Some of those chips coming back from long of the green, that fairway area, which is really more belongs to 16 than it does to 15. Those are some really interesting chips because players don't want to they don't want their ball to have too much speed when it lands on the green. So a lot of times they'll try and hit it up into that slope and slow the ball down that way. Which either they're going to hit it really well and perfectly, and it's going to be really impressive and really aesthetically pleasing shot to watch, or they're not going to hit it far enough and it's not going to make it up that hill all the way and it'll come back down towards their feet, or they'll hit it too hard and then they risk going over the green and into the other side of the water there. So that chip shot could be really interesting because it is going, you mentioned you're hitting with the slope of the green, which is not what you want. The other thing I'll mention is that they moved the tee box back last year, and there was a lot of hope that it would bring back a lot of the decision back into this hole. Like we talked about with 13, where there's a little bit of a strategy in your tee shot and your second shot of whether to lay up, to go for it. They tried to bring a little bit of that back to 15. However, there was some mixed reports coming back after 4 rounds last year. It'll be interesting to see, what it looks like after another 4 rounds this year. I think that the main complaint that I heard, and that I think I agree with, is that they didn't give themselves any option to move the tee back up. So it played relatively boring in terms of the tee shot. There's not really much strategy in the tee shot, and there's not really much strategy in the second shot. Because like you said, Drew, laying up is not really a play here on this hole. Pretty much every player is going to go for it. So it'll be interesting to see if they make any changes this year, any subtle changes, and to see how it plays this year compared to last and these past 2 years compared to previously.
Yeah, that's a good point, Caleb. And I think especially given that there are some changes made to the 13th hole that we just talked about, it's interesting to bring up the sort of feedback from 15. I would say that, the reaction we saw on 15 where, not really that much of a change necessarily, and maybe makes the tee shot a little bit more boring. I think there's more room for the change to make a material difference on a hole like 13 than there was on 15 ever, right? Because I think 15 always a higher variance hole, always balancing that risk reward more than 13 was. So I'm like, it's interesting to hear you say that, but I am confident that the changes on 13 will be better received than they are on 15 in a lot of ways, just given that there's more room for that hole, I think, to improve as far as that balancing point. Whereas you could argue that you didn't even need to move the tee back on 15. I think you could make that argument. So
yeah, I totally agree. I think, 13 is going to play a lot better. And, Scotty has played there. Rory has played there, and the early returns are very positive on 13. And I've got a lot of high hopes on 13. I think it will play, that will have a very different effect than this had on 15. I'm just curious to see what options Augusta National will give themselves for the tee placement on 15, if they have made any adjustments since last year.
Yeah. One thing I realized that I neglected to mention on 13th hole, and Caleb, you and I were talking about this earlier, but I learned the craziest fact about the 13th hole the other day, and I think this is nuts. So when you're teeing off on 13, you're basically teeing off right next to the woods, so you're hitting out like a shoot in the woods. And so on the left side, the woods kind of go right alongside where players are actually hitting out of the chute. And there are some branches that Augusta National has rigged up to cables on that left side. So when you play practice rounds, they have the cable pulled all the way back. So the branches are basically straight up in the air and out of the way when you're teeing off. And then when the tournament starts, they loosen the cable a little bit so the branches come down just a tiny bit into your line of play. So you might practice and you might be hitting balls over the corner at 13 over and over again in your practice round. And then you get there and there's a phantom branch that was not there the day before. When you were practicing for the tournament, you show up on the first day of the tournament and all of a sudden they lower these branches into your lines. So I just one of the little ways that Augusta National, I mean, that is the most, Caleb, you said it before, that is the most Augusta National thing I could possibly imagine. That's like of course they would do that. But I think that's also so cool and just illustrates like one of the really unique things about this tournament being run by the members of a club, basically, as opposed to kind of a governing body organization like you see in some of the other major championships. So there's a lot more flexibility to attach cables to tree limbs and make them movable from the line of play or not. So that's just one thing I wanted to mention on 13 before we progress over to 16. But I love that story, Caleb. I really do. I think that's I can't believe I'd never heard of that until today. That is just crazy.
Yeah, that it is very on brand for Augusta National, and I'm just imagining a bunch of members going out to Home Depot and getting ladders and doing a homemade rigging of those branches. That's too classic.
It's awesome stuff, man. It's awesome. All right, here we are on number 16, also one of the most iconic holes of the course. Number 16's flower is Redbud. So 16, only 170 yards. So again, the par threes aren't crazy long here at Augusta. I think just the greens are so severe. That's kind of the defense of the course in a lot of ways, but I think that it's not long par threes that are driving the yardage of the course. This hole is probably most famous for Tiger Woods' famous chip in at the 2005 Masters, which I'm sure almost everyone has seen a clip of at some point in time. But that was the shot when Tiger was basically long left of the green, sort of back where that tree is, kind of in the sun, in the sunlight, and right next to that bunker, and like the middle right portion of the screen you can see right now. And he had a big chip that he had to go like put up on the hill, and it rolled all the way back down. And basically the Nike logo on his ball stopped on camera, like right in front of at the edge of the hole for a second, and then dropped in. So it was like the perfect Nike ad ever. At a time when Nike Golf was still very much trying to break into the club and ball business, that was probably the best thing they could have possibly asked for from a marketing standpoint. But that's probably the most famous moment on this hole, but there are a lot of them. So this hole, not a super long par three. This view that we're looking at it from now is from the right side of the green, looking across to the left side. And so you can see left of the screen, there is a pond. So there is actually a practice round tradition where players will go down to the front of the pond after hitting their practice shots. They'll try and take a long club and skip a ball across the green or across the water and bounce it up onto the green. So obviously no one's going to try that in the tournament, but that is a fun practice round tradition at Augusta National every year. But this hole, the green slopes pretty severely from right to left, kind of everything sloping down towards the water. So hole locations that are on the left side are very accessible because players can hit the ball up on the hill and have the ball feed down right into the left side hole location. Just like we saw on number 6 in the front 9 video, there's a lot of similarities in some ways between numbers 6 and 16, in that the greens are sort of shaped similarly. And like number 6, there's also kind of a shelf on the right-hand side of the screen where they'll put the pin typically for at least one of the days of the event. And that one's a little bit harder to access because if you go down the left side, you've got a 35, 40-foot putt back up the hill to get it on top of that shelf. But if you can control your iron enough to kind of keep it on the green on top of that shelf on the right side, that's a great birdie. But you'll typically see the scores on number 16 be a lot lower on days when the pin is down on the left side. Typically on Sunday, they put the pin on 16 at like the foot of the hill, basically right in the funnel, like I mentioned on number 7 in the first 9 video. And so you see a lot of people make hole-in-ones on Sunday at Augusta on this hole. It's like one of the anecdotally, definitely one of the highest kind of hole-in-one rates on any hole on tour, really, because I feel like you see a lot of them here. And you see a lot of players hitting the ball close and making birdies. So they set it up nicely for some drama at the end of the tournament, for sure. You can miss right here. Obviously better than left because left is water, but even missing right, again, you're going to have a really speedy chip downhill kind of back towards the water. So I think players, the biggest thing is you got to just hit the green here. And if the pin's left and you hit the middle of the green, you're going to have a great look at birdie. The pin's right, hit the middle of the green, you'll have a longer look at birdie, but trying to get your par range out of there. Caleb, I don't know if you have anything additional to add here about 16.
No, Drew, I think that was pretty thorough. Some great moments here at 16. Definitely the height of the drama before we get to 17 and 18.
100%. Yeah, 16 is probably the last like really great birdie chance, depending on the pin. You mentioned 15 is kind of like the last hole you like have to birdie, and I totally agree with that. But I think 16 is the last hole where you're like, okay, birdie's really in play here before you get to the last 2. So, all right, we'll move on to 17. 17 is a par 4, 440 yards, and it is known as Nandina. So Caleb and I were joking at the start of this episode that we think numbers 14 and 17 might be the same hole because we've never seen them in the same place at the same time, and they look really similar. And the reality is they're a little bit different. The green on 17 is a little bit less severe than it is on number 14. And there are some bunkers, which you don't have at all on 14. But regardless, they're both relatively straight holes, just kind of lined with trees on either side. Nothing particularly unique about them or anything super characteristic about them that makes them stand out, at least relative to other holes at Augusta National. This hole used to have a bit more character. There used to be a tree that was basically the most famous tree in golf. That was sort of in like the middle of the fairway on this hole, called the Eisenhower tree. Former President Dwight D. Eisenhower was a noted golf fanatic. He was a member at Augusta National, and he hit that tree so many times when he played there, and he petitioned club leaders to take out the tree so many times that they started affectionately calling it Ike's tree in honor of Eisenhower's nickname Ike. And unfortunately, in 2014, I believe, there was an ice storm in Augusta, Georgia that damaged the Eisenhower tree enough to actually make Augusta National have to remove it, which is a huge bummer. So I think this hole used to have a bit more character when that was around, but it's gone now. The reality is in this hole, again, pretty straight tee shot. It's one of those ones where you're going to have to hit the fairway to control your approach shot into the green. There are bunkers to the left of the green and short of the green. And there's a big slope kind of in the back right-hand portion of the green with a false front in the front right-hand portion of the green. So this is honestly a hole where the middle of the green, as you can see, we got a great view of the green here on the visual portion of this on this hole. And I think you can see, like, if you hit the ball in the middle of the screen, you'll probably be okay. And the reality is, if you can keep the ball in the middle of the screen, you're more likely to be able to do that from the fairway. So it's an important one. I remember when Tiger Woods was up by 2 shots after birdieing 2019 Masters. I think everyone was really nervous that he would somehow blow it on the way in and not, kind of complete this long-standing comeback that he'd had from his injury issues in golf. And, when he hit the fairway on 17, I felt like the announcers seemed to take a bit of a collective breath of relief, a sigh of relief, because, again, hitting the fairway here, as long as you hit the green in the middle of the green and stay away from that false front on the front right and the bunkers in the middle and on the left side of the green, it's not one that's going to kind of keep you up at night the way some of the greens out here will. So, Caleb, I don't know if you have anything additional to add on 17. Again, not a hole with a ton going on.
Yeah, and it's in some ways a perfect bridge from Amen Corner and 15 and 16 to 18, which is a pretty tough finishing hole.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good way to describe it as a bridge. I'm actually seeing here that 17 was the 5th hardest hole in the 2018 Masters, which kind of surprises me. And again, that might have to do more with wind direction in that specific event. But I always think of 17 as being sort of between 16 and 18 as far as difficulty goes, just like you mentioned. So without further ado, we will bounce to the last hole of Augusta National, the 18th hole. I think this angle, this picture is probably not the best one actually to sort of explain how this hole works and what makes it so hard, because from here it looks pretty easy. Obviously, you got a lot of space around the green. The fairway looks pretty ample going down that right side there to the right hand of that leaderboard. But the reality is the tee shot in this hole is so tight. And so we mentioned players hit through shoots at Augusta National a number of times, kind of coming out of tee boxes. This is the most most daunting shoot of them all. I think it's the tightest one. And like I've heard so many players and caddies talk about the fact cannot even be a little bit right or a little bit left off that tee because there's so many overhanging tree branches that you might catch and your ball is going to go nowhere.
Hey, Jared.
That it kind of tense up a little bit. What's that?
Sorry, it froze a little bit. So just go back to when you were talking about the tee shot.
Okay, sounds good. In this tee shot at 18 is one of the hardest tee shots in the entire course because you are hitting out of such a tight shoot and you're basically hitting through a wall of trees on either side that if your ball is either a little bit right or a little bit left, it can very easily catch one of those trees and drop down like 100 yards from the tee box instead of the intended, 250 to 280 yard shot off the hole. You're basically hitting out towards there's bunkers right at the corner of the dog leg. So the whole dog leg is a little bit off to the right once you land in the fairway. And there are bunkers that players generally try and hit it just short of to leave themselves the best angle up the hill into the 18th green. There's a deep bunker short of the 18th green, and there's a deep bunker to the right of the green, which, Colin Morikawa and Rory McIlroy were both in that bunker on the 18th hole in the 2022 Masters, and they both hold out their bunker shots, which was remarkable because that is one of the hardest up and downs on this entire green. But that was a very special Masters moment, and I enjoyed watching them do that back-to-back last year. But if you go a little bit right, there's some big magnolia trees over off to the right side of this hole, which you can see next to the scoreboard in the visual here. And, if you're down in kind of the mulch and pine straw beneath those trees and those branches hang super low, it's just going to be really hard to get out of there. I remember when Sergio Garcia won the Masters, Justin Rose, unfortunately, hit it over in those magnolia trees and was not able to get out of them in a fashion that would help him actually win the Masters that year in the playoff with Sergio. So, this is a tough hole. The approach shot in this green is not that bad if you can hit the fairway. It plays a little bit uphill. There's that bunker short, but the green is pretty, unlike most of the greens at Augusta National, which tend to be very wide but not super deep. This is more of it's a relatively skinny green, but it's very deep. So there's a lot of room for players to miss long or miss short of the pin, depending on where it is in the green, and still have a chance to make par. The one thing I'd say is you really don't want to miss long on this hole. I remember in 2015, Jordan Spieth hit it long on the last hole on Saturday, and all the announcers were like, "Oh my gosh, he's got this big lead, but that's like the only place he can't hit it on this hole. Like, I don't know what he's going to do now." And he hit like an amazing chip shot up to a few feet and had like a tap in par, and that was he later described that as a big momentum saver for him as he moved into what would ultimately be his first major win and his Masters win in 2015. Because he knew how hard of a shot it was to actually get that ball up and down. So if players can keep it below the hole, again, we've heard that a lot today, but if players keep it below the hole on 18, the green's not crazy severe. There's one big ridge in the middle of it. So if the pin's back, you want to get it on that back ridge as much as you can without going long. And if the pin's up front, it's a pretty accessible hole location because you've got some room behind it to sort of use that ridge to your advantage. And there's a ridge in the front too that also feeds into that sort of middle hole location. So on Sunday, they'll kind of put the ball right in between the two ridges. So whether a little bit long or a little bit short, you can sort of feed one in there and hopefully make a birdie. So they definitely set up the course. I think talking about the hole locations on this back nine, Caleb, I think we can definitely see how the course is set up for fireworks and for drama and for players to make birdies and make a run at the championship come Sunday.
Yeah, for sure. This hole is not anything super special visually when you first look at it, but once you start seeing players play through it, you realize how special it really is as a finishing hole. Really the best hope that you can have is to have a big enough lead that you can 4-putt it and still win the tournament on Sunday afternoon.
That's something for some context. That's what Scotty Scheffler did last year. He was far enough ahead that he literally 4-putted the last hole and made double bogey, and still won by what, 3 shots, I think,
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he played some great golf last year, but I would say that not a lot of winners have had the luxury of being able to double 18 and still win the Masters. So regardless. Thank you guys for joining us. I mean, we love talking about Augusta National. Again, the Masters is up there as one of the favorite tournaments of pretty much every golf fan. And I think the Masters really inspired us in a lot of ways to start this podcast. We talked about, people watching golf at Augusta National enjoy it so much more than most other weeks throughout the year because they have context for the course, because they know the holes, because they have an idea of what to expect and where the good places to hit it are and the bad places to hit it are. And, our hope is that with a tournament that a lot of people know a lot about already, we were able to accentuate some of that knowledge you already have and share maybe some fun stories that go along with it, but also, provide some more insight into maybe why, some places are okay to miss and others are not. So that was our goal with this. As always, please let us know if we did a good job with that. Please rate and review our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to reference the video feature on Spotify or check out our YouTube channel throughout Masters Week to get a look at the course, our review of the course. If you're trying to scramble the night before to get an idea of what to expect on Tuesday or on Thursday morning when the tournament starts, check us out on YouTube or on Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts. But Caleb, any closing thoughts on Augusta National? I mean, there's not a lot out there that hasn't already been said about this course, but it truly is one of the best. So anything to close us out here?
Yeah, just really excited for this tournament this year. We've got a lot of players that are peaking at the right time. Rory and Scotty are coming off really good performances at the Dell Match Play, and John Rahm has been on quite a heater this year. Top 3 players in the world are truly separating themselves, and but not far behind them are some other great players that are really playing well. So this is setting up to be a great Masters, and it's always a great tournament because of the course. But I think this year especially, there's lots of drama that's going to be had throughout the beginning of the week, and we'll talk about some of that in some of our other episodes. If you haven't already checked out our preview and fantasy game show, that's out on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts as well. We'll have some general commentary on the tournament. We'll go through some of the history of the tournament itself and some of the great years and great winners that this tournament has seen over the years. So be sure to check that episode out as well. But other than that, I don't really have anything else. Enjoy the tournament, and happy Masters Week.